Welcome back to our APES flipped classroom, and we are beginning on Unit 3. So we begin Unit 3 with a little bit of a review because we've already talked about specialist and generalist species. So we're going to go into a little bit more depth here and talk about them. And then we'll also talk about what we call life history strategies. And so that is sort of reproductive strategies for ecological success. So when we talk about specialists, they have a very small range of tolerance, meaning they have a very narrow ecological niche, and that makes them more prone to extinction. So a great example of a specialist would be a panda, because the only food that it can eat is bamboo, and it actually lives in a very narrow range of altitudes as well. So because specialists have very specific requirements, they're less able to adapt to new conditions. The process of changing the gut microbiome of a panda so that it could eat something else is a very long and slow process, and it simply does not have that adaptation. And so if bamboo were to go away, or the altitudes at which the animal lives were to no longer be able to support bamboo, then the panda is very likely to go extinct. Generalists, on the other hand, have a much larger range of tolerance. They have a broader niche, and that makes them less prone to extinction. It also makes them more likely to become invasive species, because when they're put into a new environment, they are likely to be able to survive in that environment, to find something that they can eat in that environment, to find some place that they can live in that environment. So these are very adaptable organisms. And of course, one of our classic examples is the raccoon, because the raccoon can eat almost anything. It can eat animals, it can eat insects, it can eat garbage, it can eat plants. So a raccoon is very, very adaptable. It has a broad range of dietary requirements, and it can live in a lot of different habitats. Okay. So, of course, all organisms exist on a continuum, from super specialists, pandas, koalas that only have one very specific food source, to generalists that have a very broad niche. And a lot of animals fall somewhere in the middle on this spectrum, more towards specialists, maybe they only eat 2 or 3 different things, or more towards generalists that they eat a lot. Specialists are at an advantage when conditions are constant, because their adaptations, their evolution has equipped them to use the resources that are available to them as efficiently as possible. So if we look at the koala eats eucalyptus. The koala eats so much eucalyptus that it doesn't need to drink water. And that is an advantage in the environment in which it lives, because the Australian outback is a very dry location. So that is an advantage to that animal. But when conditions change, its inability to drink water, to get water, becomes a disadvantage for it. So specialists are more easily impacted, more significantly impacted by changing conditions, but they have an advantage in constant conditions. Generalists, on the other hand, have an advantage when those conditions are changing, because it means that it's less likely that their food source is going to disappear entirely. They're going to be able to find something to eat, somewhere to live. So generalists have a very high range of tolerance, and specialists have a very low range of tolerance. Specialists are more likely to become extinct. Generalists are less likely to become extinct and more likely to become invasive species. Okay, so here's your first FRQ. I want you to identify one characteristic of a specialist species and explain how that characteristic makes them more likely to become extinct than a generalist species. Make sure you're recording this in your notebook. All right, so now we're going to move ahead to 3.2, which is where we're going to talk about those life history strategies, or what we could consider reproductive strategies. And we're going to talk about K-selected and R-selected species. So when we talk about K-selected and R-selected, we're really talking about quality versus quantity. So every organism, their evolutionary goal is to survive and reproduce. Okay. And some organisms, their reproductive strategy or their life history strategy is to have a lot of offspring and hope that some of them survive. And we consider those R-selected species. And some organisms have very few offspring, but they provide a lot of care in order to make sure that those offspring survive to adulthood. So two different strategies, not that any animal is thinking through this as an evolutionary strategy, but they are two different evolutionary strategies for survival and reproduction. So let's kind of delve into those a little bit. So when we talk about K-selected species, these are the ones where we can kind of think of it as quality. They don't have a lot of offspring. They do have a lot of parental care because since they have few offspring, they require a lot of parental care to make sure that those offspring survive to adulthood. Many K-selected species can reproduce many times in their lifespan, but they don't produce a lot of offspring each time. So your larger mammals are a good example of this. Birds are a good example of this. The K-selected species have a long lifespan. It takes them a long time to reach sexual maturity. It's usually at least half of their lifespan. That means that they have a low, what we call biotic potential, meaning that their reproductive rate is very low. There's a very small number of offspring per individual. Because of that low biotic potential, they have a very slow population growth rate. And again, because of that low population growth rate, they are more likely to be disrupted by environmental change or by the introduction of an invasive species. When we look at R-selected species, now we're looking at quantity over quality. R-selected species have lots and lots and lots of offspring. They provide little or no parental care. Now, they might reproduce only once. That's what College Board would like you to know. They may reproduce many times as well. So a great example of an organism that reproduces only once is a salmon. So a salmon spends its entire lifespan. It matures in a freshwater river, swims out to the ocean, lives its adult life, mates, and then swims back up this river or stream, lays its eggs, and dies. So it only reproduces once. However, it produces thousands of eggs. So it has a lot of offspring at once. You also have some organisms that are R-selected, if you think about mice or rats, that produce many times over their lifetime, and they have lots each time. Generally speaking, R-selected species have a shorter lifespan. They reach sexual maturity quickly, so they have a very high biotic potential. Their reproductive rate is very high, and so their population growth rate can be very high given ideal conditions. Because they reproduce so quickly, they are much more likely to be invasive species. So if you have a generalist R-selected species, it is well adapted to become an invasive species. Because they reproduce so quickly, and that means that evolution, the change in a population, can happen relatively quickly. And so the R-selected species also fare better in changing environmental conditions because those adaptations can more quickly be passed down through generations. Okay, so this is just the table from your textbook. And you'll notice that this is actually sort of in direct contradiction to what College Board says. When it comes to the number of reproductive events, most K-selected species have between 1 and 5 reproductive events in their lives. R-selected species, it really varies. You can have a lot or you can have only one. So that's not a great determining factor when we're looking at K-selected and R-selected. Better determining factors would be lifespan, reproductive maturity, Number of offspring is one of the biggest key determining factors when we're trying to decide between K-selected and R-selected. Now, it's important to recognize that, like everything else in biology, it's not black and white. This is very much a spectrum. Okay, so if we look at an oyster, it can produce 500 million eggs a year. That is very clearly an R-selected species. It provides zero parental care. It just spews out eggs, has them fertilized, and hopes that they survive. Actually, it doesn't care if they survive, but evolution does. On the other end, we could talk about chimpanzees or humans that chimpanzees only have one offspring every 5 years. Very, very rarely you'll see twins in chimpanzees, and they will only reproduce 2 to 3 times in their lifetime. And they provide huge amounts of parental care. Another key characteristic of K-selected species is that their offspring are immature. They really need that parental care. Whereas if you look at something like a fish or a tadpole, it's essentially capable of providing for itself from the instant that it is hatched. So we have a spectrum from zero parental care and millions of eggs a year to parental care all the way to adulthood and very few offspring. So again, mammals are frequently offered as examples of K-selected species, but the rabbit is kind of in the middle. It has a lot of offspring. It doesn't provide parental care for very long, and it does have a lot of offspring. Whereas we look at this little frog, this is one of many poison dart frogs, and it actually carries its tadpoles around on its back. And so it does provide parental care. So it's important to recognize that it's not black and white, that we need to consider the spectrum. Okay, so when it comes to invasives and disturbances and K-selected and R-selected, so K-selected species don't respond well after disturbances because they have that low reproductive rate. It's very hard for a population to recover. And because they provide high levels of parental care, if a parent is injured or killed by a disturbance, then the offspring are likely to die as a result. Invasive species are likely to outcompete K-selected species because they reproduce more quickly and therefore they use more of the resources than a K-selected species, and they outcompete that K-selected species. K-selected species, because they're so long between generations, take longer for evolution to happen, and so they are less likely to be able to adapt to a rapidly changing environment, and therefore they are more likely to go extinct. Now, when we look at R-selected, they are much less bothered by environmental disturbances because with their high population growth, that high biotic potential, they recover much more quickly after a disturbance. Because they don't provide parental care, if an organism loses its parent, it's not a significant impact on that organism's ability to survive. And so the offspring are more likely to survive a disturbance. Since their population grows quickly and competes effectively for resources, they are not as impacted by invasive species and in fact are very likely to be the invasive species. Because they have this large population and a faster generational time, shorter span between generations, then they are likely to be able to adapt and not become extinct. So if we think back to the example of the rock pocket mouse, because the mice have such a short generation time, they were able to evolve very quickly from light-colored mice to dark-colored mice, and therefore lower their rate of extinction or their chance of extinction, even with that environmental change of the darker rock. Okay, so here's your second FRQ for this video. I'd like you to identify one characteristic of an R-selected species that could increase the likelihood of it becoming a more successful invasive species than a K-selected species. As always, I look forward to hearing your questions, and I will see you in class.